Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse podcast. And on today's webinar in the warehouse, we are going to be joined by Dex Weber, and he is the business development manager over at TGW. And TGW is focused on all things automation and helping your operations be more efficient, improved. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the topic of DC centralization, which I think is very interesting because there's certainly contrast from some of the conversation that has been going on in the industry maybe a few years ago to decentralize a little bit. But we're going to dive into that, and we're going to talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing in today's world for supply chain leaders on the distribution and fulfillment side. And Dex is going to talk to us a little bit about what he's seeing in the industry and how some of their clients, customers have addressed this, and how centralization can help you get to maybe a more efficient type of handling your fulfillment and distribution. So, first off, Dex, welcome in. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I am doing well, doing well. I am, excited to go on this topic today around centralization. I think it's super interesting. So I'm happy you're joining me today to discuss this. I think it's something that's I won't say unique, right, but a little bit of a different idea in a sense than maybe where our heads have been at for a little bit of time, right? But
Yeah,
before we
absolutely.
kind of dive into this discussion and this topic overall, why don't we kind of just get a brief overview so people understand kind of your position in the
Mhm.
market and establish a little of that expertise on your side there. So Dex, why don't you tell us kind of a little bit about what you do and what TGW is all about?
Yeah, so my name is Dex Weber. I'm a business development manager here at TGW, and my job is basically to take a kind of top down, holistic, consultative approach to helping companies really improve their operations and performance with end to end warehouse automation solutions. And as TGW, we're a global systems integrator of automated warehouse solutions. So we work with our customers to transform their fulfillment operations, enhance their shopper loyalty, and support their sales growth. And here in North America, we've empowered supply chains with companies such as the Urban Outfitters Group, Gap, Jasco, Fastenal, Automation Direct, Victoria's Secret, and many more.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely some names I'm sure people have heard of there, and some of those projects. Seen some videos and stuff. Very very impressive stuff that you've done there as well. Now we want to talk about this, and I will say, I think you're positioned uniquely. You mentioned some of the names that you've worked with there, but I'm a little jealous because the position in you're in, you get to see all these different operations and see all these things, hear all these different challenges, problems, and present solutions to people on how to address some of those challenges and problems. As just someone that's nerds out about that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
a little envious the position you're in. So definitely you're talking to a lot of different people in the industry,
Mhm.
and your job is to solve problems, right, for them. So you're
Mhm.
certainly hearing the challenges of the industry. So talk to us a little bit about, from that perspective, what is kind of your current view on some of these challenges that the supply chain leaders are facing right now when it comes to, the distribution and fulfillment side of things?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's quite a few things that supply chain leaders are really focused on right now in terms of challenges. So top of mind for a lot of people right now, of course, is the tariff and reshoring efforts,
Hmm.
and what does that mean for your supply chain and your distribution strategy? So I personally come from the furniture industry for many years, and during these first round of tariffs there was a lot of talk about moving production from China and going into other countries like maybe Malaysia or Vietnam, or a little bit more of that nearshoring effort towards Mexico. So now, when you're talking about potential changes with tariffs, it kind of brings the supply chain leaders to kind of rethink, okay, what does this mean from sourcing my products? What does this mean for my distribution strategy? what does it mean for my lead times, my inventory levels? What does this cash flow look like? So there's a lot going on with that topic right now, and I think if you've attended any of the supply
Yeah.
chain trade shows lately, it's a hot topic, and if you haven't started looking into some of the near shoring type activities, you might be a little bit behind there.
Yeah.
But another topic, of course, that's challenging for a lot of people right now is this service level agreement topic, and I think a lot of people know the quick fulfillment, with e-commerce kind of setting the standard with like the Amazon or Walmart marketplaces of the world. So the service level agreements and kind of what these younger digital native consumers are expecting is to be getting their orders pretty quickly, especially when it
Mm.
comes to kind of more standard everyday type products, and then also looking at the service level agreements for wholesale or retail replenishment. A lot of these places are struggling with maybe keeping as much labor as they'd like on hand, or expensive square footage. So you don't have a whole lot of back room for inventory. So making sure you can quickly replenish those goods is kind of an important piece to make sure products are in stock and you're meeting your customer expectations.
Mm.
Um,
Y-
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say I think it's interesting there because those two challenges that you mentioned, right? In a sense, there's a little bit of on both sides, a little bit of unpredictable factors, right? Like on
Yeah,
the tariff side, right? Certainly, we're not quite sure where it's all going to land, right? At the time of this recording here, and then on the that digitally native consumer side, right? We also don't know when, like for example, a product is going to go viral, right? And all of a sudden, there's
right.
a spike in demand. So there's a lot of unpredictability there. So I'm curious, the from the supply chain leader perspective. I mean, what are they kind of saying? Like, how are they, I guess, de-risking themselves of that unpredictability a little bit? What's the conversation there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the conversation is going around, maybe multi-sourcing products. So,
Okay.
a lot of times people are looking, where can I get the product in the most cost-effective way? But now it's like, how can I have multiple sources from the same for the same type of product, but maybe you kind of differentiate your strategy a little bit so you don't have kind of all of your eggs in one basket,
Mm.
and that's especially common in more obviously physical goods that are not like fresh or it can expire quickly, right? You can only
Yeah.
grow certain fruits and vegetables in certain areas, but yeah, I think especially in the talking a lot with the tool and equipment industry is one that I focus on quite a bit, and they're looking at how can you have multiple vendors for the same product and kind of balance out your supply chain a little bit.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting, and having that variation, right, and that variability there certainly kind of helps you to mitigate some of those risks potentially. I experienced myself during the pandemic. The company I was working for, we had all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, in
Yeah,
China with manufacturing, and yeah, we had to quickly pivot, and there was a lot of issues with that. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. So now on the service level agreements, these SLAs, how are these service level agreements kind of driving them to think a little differently around their distribution strategy?
yeah, good question. So I think you know these service level agreements are maybe driving that quick fulfillment piece. So you're thinking,
Mhm.
how can I utilize my distribution network and maybe do same day shipping or make my lead times much shorter? And is there a way to kind of leverage your existing network to do that? And what does that look like? There's also the piece of kind of cost management related to that. So, when you're looking at your distribution network and you have to look at your shipping costs over multiple distribution centers, um, do you need to add one to meet those service level agreements? What does
Mhm.
adding a distribution center look like for your costs? Or do you need to find a way to boost the speeds in your existing ones and then ship it over longer distances, and what does that shipping cost look like for you? So those are some big aspects to the service level agreements. And then kind of one of the topics that we often look at too is how can technology support those shifts for your service level agreements, and how can you really meet or exceed the expectations of your customer and deliver a great service. And there's a lot of talk about different technologies right now, and how to implement them, whether it's artificial intelligence or digital twinning, or of course automation, and what do those roles play, and what kind of benefits can you get? What is the return on investment? How does it impact your distribution network? And a lot of those kind of related questions are coming up more and more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it is, you talk about that technology, right? I mean, it's so much buzz around it, right? In the space. I mean, just not even just in supply chain, right? I mean, just in general in the
Yeah,
business world, right? It's like, how are we going to leverage this? Is it, is this actually a viable thing? Like, is this going to be here still like 3 years from now? And it is very interesting the navigation around that because it's a lot happening at once, I think, right?
yeah,
So tell us a little bit about, you know, because you mentioned there talking about, the idea of this quick fulfillment, and you mentioned in there, not necessarily having a lot of space in the back room, and how do you kind of navigate that with, getting quick replenishment and figure those things out. But the concept of DC centralization, right, is that moving away from that, or let's define kind of that concept and what does it exactly mean?
yeah. So a centralized model for distribution is basically where you have one or maybe a few warehouses spread across your distribution network. So um, you might think, looking at just the 48 states here, you might have one central distribution center in somewhere like, I don't know, Nashville, Tennessee,
Hmm.
servicing all your customers. Or could mean you have maybe an East Coast distribution center, a Midwest one, and a West Coast one. And by only having a few warehouses, you're able to meet your customer expectations and deliver across the U.S. that way, which is a bit different than this decentralized model where you're trying to get closer to the stores or closer to the customers. So this would be the opposite, where you may have multiple distribution centers even in one state just for replenishing those stores or shipping to your customers. So yeah, just kind of different models that can both work
Yeah.
depending on your needs, and then within that decentralized, uh, you know, distribution model, there is a way to maybe do what I would call more of a like a regional centralization. So you can keep that
Okay.
decentralized model, but how can you maybe make it more efficient? So in the state, let's say Michigan, where I'm located, if you have 5 distribution centers, could you still meet those service level agreements and kind of just maximize your force and your throughput out of one? And that's a kind of a topic that's getting a little bit more important these days in a lot of the conversations that we're having.
Mm. Interesting, interesting. So from a centralization perspective, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm getting rid of my entire network and just
Right.
going to one building, right? And just being like solely dependent on that. So, I mean, is that something that you're hearing more and more leaders either go after? I mean, I'm sure you've had customers that have done this already, but
Mhm.
is that becoming more of a hot conversation? And thinking about how do we scale back the network a little bit and make it a little more dialed in?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a conversation we're having. Not necessarily changing from a decentralized
Mhm.
model to a centralized model. Like, don't think it'd be an easy task for anyone to go from 50 distribution centers down to
Yeah.
one. But I would say definitely that regional centralization is becoming more of a hot topic in a lot of our conversations. But still, at the end of the day, the ultimate focus is you still need to serve your customers and replenish your stores and meet those same expectations. But how can you leverage new technologies or enhance your processes to get you there?
Mm.
And with that, you might be able to find a way that can make you more efficient and help you with kind of more savings in your and reduce complexity in your distribution model, while still achieving like a great customer experience for everyone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, right? I mean, that's always the goal, right? Is the customer experience and how to make that happen and make it a positive one for sure, right?
Mhm.
It's super important. So it's very interesting to hear this, right? And hear that this is, becoming the discussion now and, scaling back that network a little bit to become a little more centralized because I think over the last few years, right? You talk about quick commerce, right? Or like Q commerce, I think some people were calling it,
Yeah.
right? At some point, right? There was this whole kind of idea like, oh, how do we deliver in 15 minutes, right? And the reality was, I think that we've kind of seen is that people don't necessarily need everything in like 15
Right.
minutes, right? Like they can wait. They're okay with waiting, right? But that pushed, I think, a lot of this idea of being closer to the consumer, right? So you can have faster delivery and being more decentralized, I guess, in a sense, and expanding that network, and maybe having, like you said, 50 fulfillment centers or DCs in some capacity that's leveraging that. So I guess talk to us a little bit about why has that narrative shifted a little bit, right? Because that was
Mhm.
kind of like the big deal, right? It's like, oh, inventory diversification and utilization in different parts of the country, closer to the consumer, and all this stuff. So why has that kind of maybe died down a little bit, and now this centralization conversation is kind of coming more relevant and more prevalent?
Yeah, great question. And I think, this can, of course, depend quite a bit on industry, what makes sense for them or not.
Hmm.
Um, but I think this conversation has come out of a lot of different factors. So a lot of things happened over the last, 5 years. You may
Hmm.
have heard we had a pandemic at some point, right?
I heard
And
some whispers about that. Yeah, I
yeah,
did.
yeah.
Yeah.
Caused a lot of chaos everywhere. And,
Mhm.
people had to adapt. They were trying to get close to the customers. People wanted curbside pickup a lot more. So
Mhm.
just the way people were buying, pick up, order online, pick up in store, curbside pickup, those kind of changed how retailers had to operate to, uh, you know, supply the consumer with what they're looking for in a quick and satisfying way. And then when stores kind of reopened and people could go into them, maybe that slowed down a little bit. But I think some other factors that led to the shift would be like inflation, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
costs, and the wages for managing so many employees, grew at some point too. And then so now we're reaching a point where people are trying to be more conscious with their spend. And so these supply chain leaders are looking at, okay, now we have kind of more inflated costs and our consumers are maybe buying in a different way. How can we keep them satisfied, but really focus less on expanding and getting to the customers quicker to more of a mindset of we want to keep this level of servicing the customers, but how can we really manage our costs and reduce complexities in our supply chain to support that? And, can we get more out of the same workforce, especially for like a growing company? You want to be able to keep up with the demands of the customer. You want to be able to grow and scale your business, but you need to do it cost consciously. And I think that's what's kind of starting to shift this conversation a little bit more.
Yeah, interesting there, and certainly a lot of factors there driving in, and I think that it's very interesting to hear too, like how that all kind of plays this part in the distribution fulfillment world, and kind of comes back because at the core of it, right, is the product and the customer essentially,
Yeah,
right? And you're trying to deliver
absolutely.
on that customer experience, like we mentioned before, but then that product, based on cost and all those different things, is also driving a lot of decisions as well. Um, so now tell us a little bit about some of the differences there, like when it comes to looking at a centralized distribution strategy versus the decentralized distribution strategy, what is some of the, I guess, advantages, right? I mean, how does that kind of, I imagine it simplifies things, but talk to us a little bit about in what ways and how that can become like an ultimate benefit to the business, and not only the business, but I guess how does, can it benefit the customer at the end of the day too?
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking from a cost management perspective, the cost of real estate, can be quite expensive. Putting up a building with, increasing cost of materials can be quite expensive to manage. And then you think about all the equipment that needs to go into a facility. Um, like your forklifts, you have
Mhm.
lighting, you have heating, you have cooling, you have all these like electrical things you need to install. And then you look at the facility management aspect. You need to change filters, you need to change light bulbs, you need to keep things maintained, clean, working properly. And then of course you have energy costs, right?
Mm.
To heat and light and cool the building. So from a cost management perspective, if you're growing and you're looking to do more decentralization, that's like a huge piece to it is just managing more buildings and you have more duplicate costs in certain areas that can be quite expensive. So that conversation shifts to how can we maybe manage our costs more effectively.
Mhm.
Um, and then, as you mentioned, it's also that complexity. Naturally, if you're managing three warehouses in your network versus 300,
Yeah.
it can be a pretty big difference on,
It's a big
you
difference,
know,
yeah.
what that means for your structure as like an organization. With more of that decentralized approach, you may need to have, more regional managers or, different leads at each site. Uh, and with more of a centralized model, you might be able to reduce the number of people you have. You reduce the complexity for, hiring, retaining, training, your recruiting efforts. Because if you're, trying to go for maybe one or two warehouses in a region, you know, uh, instead of five or six, it's just
Mm.
a lot easier from a management perspective and just the complexity there. And then going back into that maintenance piece, maintaining,
Mm.
a couple of buildings instead of five or six could make a pretty big difference on, what your workforce looks like and what they're focused on.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's an interesting point there too on the workforce, right? Because, you you talk about that dramatic example of like 3 to 300, right? I mean, it's just
Yeah,
a huge, huge difference, right?
yeah,
But, you think about like, "Oh, well, how many people do I need in this facility?" I mean, especially if I'm doing e-commerce, right? I'm gonna have big staff, right? And if I need
yeah,
to do that over, even 10, like, fulfillment centers. I mean, that's a lot of people to worry about. And I'm curious if, this is any of the driving factor too, right? Because there's a lot of discussion around difficulty to get that labor, right?
yeah.
So, the more buildings, more labor you need to get. I mean, it does kind of streamlining, centralizing, help to make it easier to, I guess, tackle that challenge as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and I think it can. The labor shortage is something that I think we experience some just I'll call it pure chaos from
Sure.
you
Yeah.
know 2020 to 2022, I'd say. And things while they've slowed down a bit, you're also entering this kind of weird new era of you have a big population retiring or going into retirement over the next
Yeah.
few years, and a much smaller generation coming in. So labor is going to remain competitive, and when you're trying to manage all of those things across a lot of sites, yeah, that adds a higher level of complexity. And you can maybe shift to where am I going to find workers and focus on how can you make that area more efficient, so you don't have a
Mm.
plethora of workers at one site and you can't find any at another site.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think it's such an interesting, I mean, it's a very interesting time that we're in,
Yeah,
right? Because there is like a lot of this kind of shifting, transitioning, figuring out like what does I mean, I guess we're always trying to figure out what does the warehouse of the future look like, right? But it
yeah,
certainly is kind of like very much up in the air right now. I think with some of the technology that's coming out, and then these labor issues as well. So that'd be very interesting to see in a few years for sure. But if we think about centralizing these DCs and having the centralized distribution strategy, it sounds to me like, oh, it's easier, right? It's more simplified, right? But I'm sure there's some drawbacks as well. So talk to us a little bit about, why maybe you might not want to do something like that.
Yeah, there's definitely some drawbacks to more of a centralized strategy as well. One obvious one being natural disasters, right? So you have,
Hmm.
the East Coast or the South that may experience hurricanes pretty often.
Yeah.
Midwest, you get tornadoes. West Coast, you might have to deal with, earthquakes and wildfires. And so these natural disasters, one huge risk of a more of a centralized strategy is if something were to happen, you don't have the ability to, service your customers and you can wipe out your stock pretty quickly. So that's a pretty big risk that, you'd have to take with more of that centralized strategy. Um, Another aspect is shipping costs. So it really depends on the type of goods you have. So, uh, you know, lighter goods, yeah, you can maybe ship cost effectively from, across the US. But once you start getting into maybe some more bulky or heavier items, those shipping costs can jump up pretty significantly. So at some point, depending on which type of products you're selling,
Mm.
um, that centralization just may not make sense for you from a shipping cost because it will just eat you up a little bit. And then, of course, the delivery times. It really depends on how quickly you're able to process goods. What are your customers expecting? How quickly do your stores need to be replenished? And so, if you are looking at a centralized model, the risk or the drawback there could be, you might have to take 1 or 2 more days to get the product to where it needs to go. And is
Mm.
that right for your consumer? And for your store replenishment, uh, what does that mean for your store, replenishment and inventory levels? So if you run out of
Right.
an item, it takes 3 days to get in there. How does that impact your sales? And what does that mean for you know, your fulfillment? So that could be a potential drawback of it as well. And then back to the whole labor topic and skill shortages. So um, sometimes you look at these like major distribution hubs where it's a sea of fulfillment centers, and you know when you're operating in those kind of big distribution hubs, retaining and keeping labor can be a little bit more challenging. So if you only have a few distribution centers and they're all in areas where it's maybe hard to recruit and retain people,
Mm.
it could increase your costs with the wages pretty quickly. So those would be some of the bigger drawbacks that people would see when they're considering, a centralized approach or even, maybe some of the regional centralization.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And I think it's interesting. You touch on the customer experience there a little bit because as we said a couple times here now, I guess that the customer experience is like at the core, right, of
Right.
that delivery, and how do we enable that to be a positive one? But I'm curious because there's a couple companies that you've worked with, right, and
Mhm.
when they've kind of centralized distribution strategy, I mean, does the customer really feel that impact? I mean, have you heard of any scenarios where, that it's really become like an issue for their customers, or, do customers not necessarily, I won't say don't care, but like, are they not as concerned about an extra day or two on their delivery anymore?
Yeah, and I think that can change quite a bit by industry. So ultimately, supply chain leaders need to know who their customers are and what their expectations are. But I know personally from a centralized approach, sometimes when I order something and I'm very excited for it, and then I see, oh, the label was created, just builds that excitement in me. I know this
Yeah.
product's coming, and then I watch it sit for 3 days, and I'm like, oh, well, this is kind of like irritating. It's not actually going out, and then it takes 3 4 days to ship to me. It's like, oh, what I expected in maybe 2 or 3 days takes five
Mm.
or six, and so it could be a little disappointing sometimes from that centralized strategy. um, but that's why it's kind of important to know where are your customers buying from.
Mm.
And I think that could be a common piece too, to especially like, let's say, smaller e-commerce companies. Like, they just don't have the ability to be, more decentralized, or
Yeah.
maybe have even three warehouses across the U.S. So it's sometimes it's just a little bit of growing pains, but um, I think a lot of times people don't necessarily care, or they feel no impact from taking
Mm.
more of a centralized approach. So, for example, we're pretty strong in the fashion retail industry, and so we have multiple partners here in the U.S. that operate with more of a centralized distribution strategy. Um, and with this, because those products are, they tend to be lighter goods, the
Right.
cost of shipping them from just a few hubs is not too bad. And then it's, of course, easier for them to have a few facilities to maintain and operate and bring goods in and out of. So, with the fashion industry in particular, it's easier to have just a few locations across the US, and then they operate your wholesale, your store replenishment, and your e commerce operations kind of out of each facility. So, from a customer experience standpoint, when you go to the store the next day, it's already kind of replenished. Or if you order online, it's shipped that same day and it arrives in 1 or 2 days. So you would have
Mm.
no idea that it's more of a centralized strategy versus a decentralized strategy, because you place your order and in 1 or 2 days it's already on your doorstep.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting point there. And yeah, I will say that that pesky label created.
Yeah,
Say we're in the industry. We know what that means.
yeah,
Uh,
yep,
yeah, but I think it is a great point though that you have to understand like your customer and understand your product too. I think that's a great point as well, where you're saying this apparel is a little lighter, so the cost is not as much to ship it a little faster. But I think also if you look at the centralized idea and this strategy, this probably ties into some of these labor challenges that we're talking about too. I mean,
mhm.
you guys are focused on automation, right? So talk to us a little bit about, how does automation play a part in moving to a centralized strategy and making that effective overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So automation, obviously, it's all focused on process improvements, boosting throughput, making your workforce, um, you know, uh, at a like a or makes your workforce at a level where it's maybe higher performing. Um, and so automation can help with a centralized strategy. So, like I mentioned, the fashion industry, you place an order online and the goods are prepared and at the shipping station in 10 minutes. So
Mhm.
it can be really fast. And then you look at maybe more of that regional centralization model of what automation can do for companies. Uh, it can also help you make more out of your regional DCs. So you might be able to kind of consolidate some. So, for example, we have a big retailer in the home improvement DIY kind of space.
Okay.
Um, and so obviously for that kind of model, it's more decentralized, right? If your store's out of hammers and somebody's working on a project, they're just going to go to the next store and you'll lose a sale, right? So that quick store replenishment is important, and then also getting products ready for shipment to work on projects, especially home improvement projects. People need stuff kind of instantly. So with that decentralized model, we can still help them on that regional centralization with automation. So for example, we helped a company take four regional DCs and kind of combine them into one.
Mm.
And that's where the automation technology can really boost the speeds, boost the storage density and utilization of their warehouse, so that they can make one distribution center uh, more effective than having the four regionally. And it can still meet those service level agreements to fulfill, um, mixed case pallets for their store replenishment for those small
Mhm.
back rooms, but also helps them achieve quick e-commerce shipments to their customers as well, or maybe ship to project sites pretty quickly. And so, what automation really can help with is, we'll say, space utilization. You think about the warehouse, and if you have a forklift going in and out of the aisles, you need enough space to
Mhm.
move those. those pallets around. And then your racks are typically set to certain levels. And so if your SKU portfolio changes, you may have underutilized space there. So that's where that storage density gets to be a big portion of it. Lifting, moving heavy objects, or just multiple manual touches from receiving to putting away to pulling down off the racks to picking some for like a split case. You put the product back on the racks, and there's a lot of touch points in there. So automation can also help with that process to remove those manual touch points, moving those big, slow, kind of
Mm.
hard to move, bulky products onto pallets. Helps with like the ergonomics. So when you think of uh, retailers, traditional fulfillment or distribution centers where they're maybe batch picking with carts, you're going around and you might walk 15 miles in a day,
Yeah.
picking and pulling items, and it may take you 45 minutes or an hour to put that together. So with automation, you can kind of remove a lot of those manual, wasted times walking, and you can make people more efficient. And then hopefully, with the better ergonomics too, it helps with your labor constraints. So,
Mm.
helping retain that labor, making them feel more empowered to do more and do a great job, and can also help your workforce focus on some other areas where repetitive kind of tasks are taken over by the automation, so they can really focus on improving in other areas of the warehouse, or maybe like value added services, for example. So there's a lot that opens up with that. And then really it's the fulfillment time can reduce significantly to make
Mm.
your fulfillment center, much more effective. And then when you think of the cost perspective, packaging, if you're doing a lot of e-commerce shipment, you don't want to ship a whole bunch of air. That adds
Right.
cost to it, right? So automation can help with right size packaging. So you can fit more on your trucks, you can fit more on your pallets for store replenishment, and you can also have smaller boxes going to your customers.
Mm.
Um, and lastly, I would say automation helps with order flexibility. So you think of the distribution centers that are, you may traditionally have one for e-commerce and then one for retail and wholesale.
Right.
Uh, well, the way people buy changes and shifts, so you might have it to where your retail wholesale distribution center might be kind of underutilized, and your e-commerce could be bursting at the seams. So what automation can do is kind of combine those different warehouses into one and give you more flexibility, so you can manage wholesale, store replenishment, and e-commerce in one facility, and you know manage your labor and your throughput way more efficiently.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's such a important thing there because a lot of times, I mean, I think especially from like the consumer side, but we think about how do we get faster delivery, right? How do we get a
Mhm.
carrier that's cost effective, but can deliver in 2 days or something like that? But on the inside of the four walls, right? There's still a lot of time that can be made up there. So,
Mhm.
so tell us a little more on the automation side. Like, how much of an impact does the speed of delivery get from a faster processing time within the four walls? Like, what are the potential dividends there by speeding up your process time?
Yeah, by speeding up the process time, you might be able to kind of buy yourself more time from the shipping time. So,
Mhm.
for example, in my experience in a manual warehouse, uh, we would often have a mix of orders, and we'd have like our orders going out via FedEx for e-commerce, and then we would of course have our palletized mixed case orders going to retailers or other manufacturers, for example. So with that, with the manual labor, it often meant that we spent quite a bit of time putting those products together and ready for shipment and staging them, especially for mixed case pallets. It's a lot of manual effort.
Mm.
So that meant we would kind of put it together and it wouldn't be able to ship until the next day. But if you're looking at automation, instead, you can process it much quicker, ship same day. So even if you do a regional centralization and it takes one more day to arrive at your store or arrive at your customer, um, it's shipping one day earlier. So you almost can still service that same speed of delivery and service level agreement, but buy yourself one more shipping day
Mm.
and save yourself on some costs and uh, manual labor that could be automated.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's such a great point to think about too, because it's those in a lot of cases those cutoff times are real, right? So if you
It,
can
it can be
get
tough,
that,
and
yeah,
sometimes the trucks show up early, and you're stressed out finishing up those last minute
yeah,
orders.
yeah, the driver is like standing there looking at you like, yeah, let's go.
You got another stop to make, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think that processing time within the four walls can make such a huge impact too on
yeah,
the speed of that delivery. So, you know, centralizing and then leveraging automation. I mean, it sounds like a great mix to be able to still optimize and still maintain a quick delivery, whether it's directly to the customer or from a replenishment perspective as well. So very interesting, talking about this topic and some of the challenges that supply chain leaders are facing right now, and looking at how automation can also come into play when you go the centralization route, or even looking at when it doesn't make sense, right, to centralize too as
yeah,
well. So for people that are watching this and listening, what would you tell them if they're thinking that maybe centralization is the right strategy for them? I mean, where do they start? Like, how do they begin to evaluate what their network looks like now and start to assess whether or not that's the right decision to make?
yeah, absolutely. So the first and foremost thing you really need to think about is your customer experience. Like, what does the customer expect from when I place my order? When am I going to get it? And this could be different depending on the industry. So, for example, uh, luxury goods, people are
Mhm.
more about the value added services, the nice boxing, the
Yeah.
presentation. Like, that doesn't need to be as quick, but grocery stores, they need stuff fast, fresh, right away. So when you're considering centralized distribution strategy or maybe regional centralization, you need to still think about what is the goal of delivery for my customer and what does that customer experience look like. And then you need to also look at things like labor availability. If you try centralizing in the wrong areas and you don't have the labor, that could be a huge challenge for you. So you kind of need to research, where's the right fit for you, and then also how can technology maybe support your labor aspect there. And then another big piece is the type of goods you're shipping. So again, fresh goods you need on the shelves right away,
Mhm.
but also heavier goods you can't really ship those across from Florida to California in a cost-effective way. So the type of goods you're shipping will make a big impact on what distribution strategies make more sense to you. And then of course, as you're investigating these technologies to support your distribution strategy, you need to consider things like what are the policy impacts, especially when you're talking about the hot topic of artificial intelligence right now. How do those policies impact what you can
Yeah.
do with the technology? What is the cost of the technology um, look like, and how do you build that business case out of it? What does that return on investment look like? And then how does it impact your workforce when you're implementing new technologies? And how can it make them happier, more efficient, and how can it also help you retain that labor piece? So uh, those are a lot of the main things I think people are considering when they're looking at their distribution strategy and how to be more effective. And then, of course, how do you find the right partners to help you achieve this? So,
Mm.
looking and doing your research and finding reputable companies to help you achieve those goals is, yeah, another important piece, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think really great tips there and really great insights there on how to go about that and what to look at and navigate. And so now you're dealing with this, right? You sound like you've talked to a couple customers about this.
Yeah.
I'm sure at this point, right? Our topic here. So at what point? Because we talked about how automation can help, right, in going about this strategy and still maintaining like some of those service levels that you had before as well, or at least helping you come close to them as well. At what point, you know, would they consider like engaging somebody like a TGW to help them along with this strategy?
Yeah, great question. So engaging with an automation integrator like TGW can be done kind of in your early phase of research too. Like, we talked to quite a few customers, and they're like, our management wants us to look into automation, but we don't really know anything about it.
Yeah.
Our job or my job as a business development person is to really help them understand some of the automation technology that's out there. They can also do plenty of their own research online as well. But really, it can't be looked at one specific technology, right? You kind of need to take a holistic approach to it. So, approaching a consultant or an automation integrator can really help you understand, okay, here is your distribution center. Here are some of the processes you're doing, and we can kind of
Mm,
evaluate those. And then we can look at the SKU data and say, hey, okay, here's what your product portfolio looks like. And then from there, what we can do is kind of understand, okay, does automation make sense for what you're looking to accomplish? Yes or no? And then if the answer is yes, it's like, great, okay, which kind of technologies would make sense for you? And we can really help coach and evaluate the different options with the companies. And that's what every integrator out there does as well, is they really help companies understand, okay, this is what automation technology we can do. And then we can also
mm,
help with understanding what is the impact, like what processes are going to be affected. What does that mean to, your labor pool working in those distribution centers? So we can help understand that piece and kind of build the business case out for you. So helping you understand, okay, now that I am interested in automation, I know it could benefit me. Here's how I benefit from it. Here's what this return on investment looks like, and here's what we hope to achieve and how we can measure, our success with this. So, pretty much at the early phase of I don't know anything about automation and I'd like to
yeah.
know more, people can reach out to automation companies and they can really help coach and consult them and point them in the right direction.
All right, fantastic, definitely, and I think that's a good thing to hear because I think a lot of people are probably in that camp that you described, right? It's like, my boss said we need to look at automation, and I'm like, where do I start, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And it can be a little overwhelming sometimes. I think people hear automation and they're immediately thinking like, "Oh, I got to invest, 50 million into this."
yeah,
But really, there are technologies that you can start with. Maybe a couple of mobile robots can help you achieve what you need to do. But maybe it is you look at a giant, more automated system, and it can really transform your operations, especially as a larger company, significantly. So, there are technologies for any size of the company. It's just does it make sense for you, and what are the right technologies to meet your needs?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great message to end on here, and being able to find that right solution and the right strategy for you too as well. Everything is not necessarily one size fits all, so definitely, leverage expertise and do your research and leverage folks like TGW to help you do that. So, if people want to do that, Dex, what's the best way to start to engage with TGW or learn more about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm heavily active on LinkedIn. So you can search for Dexter Weber on LinkedIn. I'm sure I'll pop up there. TGW also has a great presence on LinkedIn. So we have TGW Logistics Group, which is our full organization. We also have a page for TGW North America. So that covers just our America's entity, I would say. And then of course on our website we have uh, yeah, tgw-group.com. Uh, that's another great way to reach us. Or if you wanted to reach out to me personally, uh, dexter.weber at tgw-group.com, and you can reach me there.
All right, fantastic. And we'll make sure everybody gets those links and they're easily accessible. So, Dex, thank you so much for joining me today, and really appreciate the insights and the conversation around not just DC centralization, but just warehousing and some of the supply chain challenges and potential solutions there in general. So, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation, and yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to, talk on here and yeah, get to talk a little bit more about what I get geeked about.
Definitely, definitely. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning into today's video here on our YouTube channel, the New Warehouse Podcast, and I appreciate you tuning in. If you liked what you saw, make sure you subscribe to our channel, and if you like this video in particular, make sure you like it as well. And if you want to get this great t-shirt that you see in the video behind me, Warehouses Are Sexy, head to warehousesAreSexy.com and get your own.